And we're back for another episode of the HFC, I was saying the HFC Kids Show. Another episode of the HFC Kids Show. Tune in for the HFC Kids Show on the Facebook group Wednesdays at 6, featuring you guys. Welcome back, HFC kids, for another week learning about the Old Testament and God's amazing story before Jesus. This month we've been learning about the Judges era, and we learned about Gideon and Ehud and Eglon, and last week we talked about Samson, and this week we're talking about the last judge before we transition into the era of kings. If you haven't been following along, we learned about several judges already and about how they would come in and help the people of Israel. And right now in the story, their big enemy is the Philistines. The Philistines fought against the Israelites like crazy. But when the Israelites were following God, Israelites would win, but sometimes the Israelites wouldn't follow God and the Philistines would get some wins. So it's just back and forth whether they're trusting in God against the Philistines or not. And that brings us to this time period where there's a man named Eli in charge. He's a priest, a really high up priest. People knew who Eli was. He was a pretty big deal. He made their sacrifices. He listened to God. He prayed on behalf of the people. Eli also had two sons, and those two sons were also supposed to be priests. They were also supposed to follow God. And they were also supposed to listen to God and pray on behalf of the people. But just like the Israelites would sometimes follow God and then start doing their own thing, Eli's sons sometimes followed God, but eventually got to the point that they were doing their own thing. They didn't care about God anymore. They didn't listen to him. They still lived in the temple with their dad, but they didn't care what God had to say, and they didn't listen to their dad Eli when he tried to correct them. So, in order for the people of Israel to be corrected, God had to bring in a judge. And actually, this is the last time he's going to bring in a judge, because this judge is going to change so much for the people of Israel. Most of the judges we first hear about when they're adults, when they're already doing stuff, when they're already leading, when they're grown people that come in to do what God says to do. But this guy, this last judge, we learn about him from the very beginning of his life, actually before he was born. In the land of the tribe of Ephraim, there was a woman named Hannah. And Hannah was really sad because she was married, but she couldn't have children. All she wanted to do was be a mom. All she wanted to do was have kids so she could see her husband become a dad to them. She was so excited to become a mom, and it never happened. She wasn't able to have babies of her own. But she had heard stories about people trusting in God. Remember the story of Sarah? A few months ago, we learned about Sarah trusting in God and Abraham listening and saying, even though we can't have kids, God will give us a son. And God gave Sarah the son Isaac. I'm sure Hannah would have grown up hearing these same stories. Those were her ancestors, like her great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents that this happened to. So she prayed and she prayed and she said, God, I trust you. I believe in you. I want to listen to you. Give me a son. If you give me a son, I will send him to the temple and he will be raised to be a servant of yours. He'll become a little priest. He'll become someone that you love. I'll raise him or send him to Eli so that Eli can raise him to be a child of God, to be a priest. So, God saw Hannah's amazing faith and amazing trust, and God liked the promise that Hannah was making to him, and he knew that she would fulfill it. So God gave her a son, and the son was born, and they named him Samuel, which means God is listening. The book of the Bible that this story all takes place in is called 1 Samuel. There's actually 2 books named after Samuel. That's how big of a deal he is. It starts on the very beginning of his life, actually before he was born. It starts with his mom's life, and then it follows all the way up until he dies, and it takes up 2 whole books of the Bible. Like, all of this is talking about Samuel, and he does a lot for the kingdom of Israel. When baby Samuel was born, chapter 1 says that Hannah prayed to God and said the reason she named him Samuel, which means God listens. In verse 27 and 28 it says, "For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord, and as long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." And she handed him over to Eli. Eli in the temple was now in charge of raising little Samuel. So Samuel grew up. It says he grew up following God. He grew up helping in the temple. In chapter 2, in verse 18, it says Samuel was ministering before the Lord. As a boy, he was clothed with the linen ephod, which means he was dressed like a priest. He was a little priest running around everywhere in the temple, just like the adults would do. He was learning to be just like them, even from a super young age when he was a boy. However, if you remember, I said a minute ago, Eli hadn't really been the best dad. His sons that were raised with him were not following God. Samuel was doing a really great job, but Eli's actual sons were not following God. So God spoke to Eli and said, "You need to get your sons under control. If your sons don't start following me, then it's going to be bad news for all of you." When God went to Eli, he said, "I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what's in my heart and in my mind." He's like, if your sons aren't going to listen, then I'm going to find someone else who will listen. I will build him a sure house, and he will go out before my anointed forever. He's like, get your sons in line, or your sons are about to lose all the privileges they were supposed to get as priests in my temple. And guess what? The sons didn't listen. The sons did not want to follow God. They wanted to keep doing things their own way. And God was trying to tell them, and they weren't listening. And when they didn't listen, God says, all right, I'm going to find someone who will listen to me then. Remember back when we talked about the story of Gideon and about how God shrunk Gideon's army to just 300 men? And the reason he wanted the army to be so small is so that God could prove to everyone that it was his power. It didn't make any sense that an army of 300 could beat the Moabites. But because God was with them, they were able to do great things. He kept this in mind when he chose a lot of people in the Bible. He would choose people that were small or weak or not popular so that they could change the world and help the Israelites. And when it was somebody that was big and popular, everybody just thought, oh, they're big and popular. That's what's so special about them. But when they're little and doing great things, everybody realized that it must have really been the work of God, because no little unpopular person could do it on their own. So when God told Eli, I'm going to raise someone up to be a more powerful priest than you and your sons were, if your sons don't listen, Eli probably pictured a big, powerful man. God had different plans in mind. He was going to raise up the little boy in their temple, Samuel. And God was going to prove that he could do amazing things through the little boy's faith. And Samuel always did what he was supposed to do. He always followed the rules, and he always followed God. But God had never actually spoken to him. So we have to see, is Samuel going to listen to God, or is he going to be like Eli and Eli's sons and just do their own thing? So in 1 Samuel chapter 3, it says that Samuel was sleeping in his room. And it says that the Lord called out to Samuel. And Samuel, when he heard it, he said, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, Eli, you called?" And Eli said, "I didn't call. Go lay down again." And he went and laid down. God said something. Samuel heard the voice of a man and was super confused. So he went and ran to Eli and said, "Eli, did you call for me?" And he was like, "No, I didn't call for you. Go back to bed." And then the Lord called again and said, Samuel. And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me, Eli. But Eli said, I didn't call, my son. Go back and lie down again. And Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. He didn't realize that God could actually talk to him. So he kept thinking, if someone's talking to me, it must be Eli. It didn't even register that it might have been God talking to him. And then the Lord called Samuel again, the third time. And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, you called me. And Eli perceived, he realized that it was the Lord calling the boy. And Eli said to Samuel, Go, lay down, and if he calls you, you should say, Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. So Samuel went and laid down in his place. And this time, the fourth time God called, Samuel replied, when he heard Samuel, he said, Oh, God's talking to me. And he listened to God. And he said, God, what do you want me to do? I'll follow you. I'll listen to you. What do you want me to do? And God told Samuel, You need to go to Eli. He is not listening. His sons aren't listening. Go tell Eli that if he and his sons don't get it together, then they're going to die. Now, these were like his family. They were like his big brothers and his father. And Samuel was just a little boy. And now he was supposed to go and tell his father and brothers that they were going to die? It broke Samuel's heart. He cried. He went to Eli the next day and he said, Eli, I listened to God and he said you're going to die. How? Why are you going to die? Tell your sons to follow God. You need to follow God or you're going to die. But Eli didn't. He didn't follow God, and his sons didn't follow God either. So they were killed in a battle against the Philistines. And it broke Samuel's heart that the Philistines had killed his big brothers, basically. These are the boys that he grew up with, these sons. Even though they were bad, they were still the people that Samuel grew up with. And it broke his heart. And then when they went and told Eli, Hey, Eli, your sons died today. Eli's heart broke too. And it said he fell out of his chair. And when he fell, he died too. So now Samuel was heartbroken. He listened to God, but the other people didn't listen to God. So he was the only one left. He was the one now in the temple. He became, as the boy, he grew up and became the high priest. He was a very big, important priest to the people of Israel. And it was really sad how his story started, but it's all because he listened to God. And just like in chapter 2, when God says, I'm going to raise up for myself a faithful priest, he was telling Eli about Samuel. And it says, he will go in and out before my anointed forever, which means he was going to be in a really powerful position and God was going to use him for amazing things. He was the judge. When the Israelites weren't following God, when Eli and his sons weren't following God, Samuel was the one who came in and said, Hey, you need to listen to God or bad things are going to happen. And they didn't listen and bad things happened. But the reason Samuel lived and the reason Samuel becomes so powerful and is able to do so many things for chapters and chapters and chapters of the Bible is because he listened to God. Even as a boy, he listened to and followed God. The same faith that his mom Hannah had, he had. And we're going to learn more about what he did when he grew up and was doing more work for God. We'll learn more about that next week. But I wanted to introduce you to the story of Samuel and how he started as Israel's last judge. But the basic part of the story is that God can speak to kids and use them for great things. Samuel was just a little boy, but he heard from God and he listened to God and he followed God. Just because you're a kid doesn't mean God can't use you for things. Doesn't mean God can't still speak to you. We're going to learn about these amazing things that Samuel did when he was older, but he didn't have to wait until he was older. You don't have to wait until you're older. You can listen to God and follow God now. I hope you guys have a great week. Be sure to tune in Wednesday on the Facebook page to watch this week's episode of the HFC Kids Show, where we're going to be featuring more kids, more fun, more games, and you're going to get to see some of your friends in action. See you next Sunday, HFC Kids. Samuel was a really good listener. He had really good ears. He could hear God talking. Tell me what this noise is. Can you guess it?